Today we're going to talk about, should we try to maintain the home-owning democracy? If so, how can millennials be encouraged to save for a deposit? So we have an excellent panel of speakers today. So from my left we have Bob Seeley MP for Isle of Wight.
Hello.
On my left we have Robert Jenrick MP, Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury. And on my right, Gillian Keegan, PPS in the Treasury and MP for Chichester. And on my far right, Stephen Bush, Special Correspondent from the New Statesman. So I think it's always worth explaining why we are running an event like this, a Fringe. Why do we want to talk about the home-owning democracy? I think ultimately it's because it's in an accelerated decline. Whether you see that as a good thing or a bad thing, it's a fundamental change in our society and in our economy, so it's something worth talking about. So just in terms of the event structure, I'll provide a few introductory remarks to set the scene. We'll then have 3 or 4 minutes from each speaker, then we'll have a quick panel discussion, then we'll go to the Q&A for very, very, very precise questions with question marks at the end of each question, please. So, as I said, we are witnessing the accelerated decline of the home-owning democracy. I've got some figures in front of me. Now, 33% of people own their property outright. They're not paying a mortgage. Sorry, this is in England. 29% of people own with a mortgage. 21% own with, 21% privately rent, and 19% socially rent. So the numbers of people, the proportion of people that own with a mortgage has declined by about 10, 12, 13% in about 10 to 15 years. The number of people privately renting has doubled in the same period. The brief explanation of that is that fewer people are taking out mortgages than the numbers that who have paid theirs off. So what we are witnessing is the accelerated decline of the home-owning democracy. So it's quickly worth asking why. So since 2008, there are much stricter lending controls. It's much more difficult to get a mortgage. Second, that probably the one that's most obvious to us all is house prices have just grown hugely in many parts of the country. Just last week, there was an article saying first-time buyers need an average £53,000 salary to buy a home in the UK's 20 largest cities. In London, that's £82,000 income. At the same time, incomes have grown steadily and prices have essentially just outstripped that. So it's declining and it's probably going to continue still. Very few millennials are saving. Just 23% are saving anything towards a mortgage deposit at all, those who are renting. We're basically moving to a situation where whether you can own your own home is determined by your parental wealth. So why should we care about this? Well, to me, there are lots of bad points about home-owning democracy. There's an obsession with house prices. So we saw Mark Carney's comments, a couple of weeks ago, that house prices could crash by a third in a no-deal Brexit. It sounded Armageddon-like. Now, to me, as a millennial renter, actually, that sounded like a good point to Brexit, to be honest. But I'm sure other people think differently. The second aspect, the worst of the home-owning democracy, is the hijacking of the planning system by NIMBY homeowners. So the balance between supply and demand has kind of gone askew since mass home ownership. I would welcome private renters taking back control of the planning system. But there are many positives as well of the home owning democracy. So cost, you tend to spend much of people who are paying off a mortgage put 17% of their spend 70% of their income on mortgage repayments. Private renters spend 35% of their income on rent. There's also an issue of quality, of personalisation. So in the flat that I rent, I don't really have the capacity to paint my bedroom a different colour because I'd like to. My landlord might let me, but there's not much point to me doing that because I'll probably be gone in a year. So I think that's a really important point that's often missing from this debate over home owning democracy. There's also the issue of security tenure, but perhaps we're in a political conference. There's also a question of ambition. The vast majority of people want to own their home. 60% of private renters expect to buy their home. So if people owning their own home is a big event in their life, I think it's good if politicians want to make that happen. So there's also clearly a political dimension to this. Homeowners tend to vote Conservative, private renters tend to vote Labour. That was even more so in the last election. So today, I want to ask, do the positives outweigh the negatives? Should we try to rebuild the home-owning democracy? Or do the negatives outweigh the positives? Should we just have a managed decline and begin to focus a bit more on private renters? So with that, I'm going to pass over to Robert.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rob Jenrick. I'm one of the junior ministers in the Treasury. I've only been doing this since January, so I'm still in my ministerial nappies. But I am the Treasury's token millennial. So I get to teach Philip Hammond how to use Snapchat and try to tackle some of these issues. But the question, should we just manage decline? Absolutely not. I think this is one of the most important issues for our party, for the government, and for the whole of the country. Nothing matters more to us. And I think that those of you in this audience who are conservatives should think, how will you feel in 2022 when it's 1 minute to 10 o'clock at night and there's the exit poll is about to come out and David Dimbleby is about to tell a waiting nation whether we have a Conservative government or a Jeremy Corbyn Labour government. And if at that moment you know that you will be worried, concerned, that you will be skipping a breath because you care about the future of the country, then if you care that much, you have to work night and day, and as a minister, you have to wake up and go to bed at night from now until then, thinking about housing and how we can get more young people onto the housing ladder. It does matter. It's about giving people the ambition, it's about personal responsibility, it's about family and community, it's about all of the issues, the tenets of Conservatives throughout the ages. And if we lose that, then I think we will have let the country down and we will have let the party down. So there's a huge task ahead of us. What are we actually doing? Well, this is a supply side challenge primarily. So we are, and the Kit Malthouse, my colleague at the Department for Housing, is straining every sinew to increase the number of homes. And there are many different things we could talk about with that. But how can we help young people to save more for their deposit? Well, it's obviously very difficult because incomes have been constrained and saving of any kind is not where we'd like it to be in the country. But we are taking steps. We have abolished stamp duty for almost all first-time buyers, a hugely successful and popular policy in the last budget. We've created the Help to Buy ISA. I think there's probably more that we could do there to create incentives for people to save more of their income towards a deposit. But is this the central challenge? Absolutely, it is. We have to think about generation rent and the concerns that they have. I think that it is important that we look at security of tenure. Practical things of daily life, like how you can have broadband when you move into your new flat as a millennial, not having to wait a couple of weeks for it to be installed. But those challenges are a distraction from the primary ambition of this government, which is to shift the dial and get more young people onto the housing ladder by the time of the next election and be able to revert to the electorate, hopefully in 2022, and say that we've listened and we've taken this issue seriously and people can see a clear plan for us to deliver. If we don't, then we will lose the next election and we'll deserve to lose it. So as a minister and at the Treasury, there are few challenges beyond Brexit that we care about more and that we're devoting more time and energy to.
Fantastic. Bob, you promised me you're going to disagree.
I think I'm going to disagree, but in a sort of helpful kind of way. Hello, I'm Bob Seeley. I have the huge and wonderful privilege of representing the Isle of Wight, which I know to be the most beautiful place on earth, but I would say that because I represent it. Yes, of course, we need a home-owning democracy. The problem is we're not going about it the right way, and it may cost us the next election, despite what the government says. As much also as I admire Robert, because I think he's a top bloke. I'm going to talk in relation to the island, but a lot of what I have to say is as applicable to Dartmoor as it is to Dagenham. So that should cover most people here. The system is bust, and I have yet to see the evidence that it is getting better. Does anyone know how many affordable homes were built in the Isle of Wight in the last 3 years? before we get an embarrassed silence, I will tell you, 18 this year, 34 last year, 35 the year before, under 100, and that's homes at 80% of the national average. And because we earn 70% of the national average on the island, we can't afford even affordable homes. Developers should not be controlling the housing market, and that's what happens at the moment, because developers build what they want, not what my island or our communities need. Developers in the Isle of Wight want to build 3 and 4 bedroom houses to attract pensioners from Birmingham and Reigate and everywhere else. What the island needs is 1 and 2 bedroom homes. And our ability to stipulate that is very limited because we are reliant on the 106 money, the money you get from the developers for the crumbs from the table. I have an additional problem, and I'll come to targets in a second because they're way too high and ridiculous for the island and indeed for other parts of Britain. My other problem is that there is not enough exceptional circumstance and exceptional purpose built into the system. My landscape is the second most painted part of Britain, along with West Cornwall. The landscape of Tennyson and Turner and Keats, I'm damned if I'm going to see it ruined by persimmons and Barretts and Wimpeys. Because at the same time, as well as knackering my landscape, pardon my vulgarity, it destroys my tourism economy, which is between 5 and 40% of my economy, depending who you talk to. Well, so when government says, oh, we'll build more homes, I'll say, okay, but you're killing my economy. And the other thing you're doing is because we're importing, and we have a lot of young people on the island, don't get me wrong, we have a festival every week. I mean, my job in summer is basically going to lots of festivals. It is arduous and taxing, but I do my best. The targets are wrong as well because I need to build for young people. I need greater control. To have a free market, I need greater control over housing because I don't want the developers telling me what I want to build, because I need to offer my youngsters a place to live on the Isle of Wight. And at the moment, we don't get it. And we need that flexibility built into the system. And every time I ask for flexibility, I get answers from ministers which tend to be technically accurate, but actually somewhat misleading. And I shouldn't say that, because it's probably not a very nice thing to say. So, for example, oh, Bob, don't you know about the 9 billion to kickstart the council housing? Well, then I go back and look at the small print, and you have to have a housing revenue account. And guess what? The Isle of Wight doesn't have a housing revenue account. So can I get hold of the 9 billion? No, I can't. My council wants to build council housing. We need a new generation of council housing, whether we like it or not. And before you say, oh my God, are you in the wrong conference? No. Whether we like it or not, a third of all housing, if we are ever going to meet government targets from 1945 onwards, a third of housing, new housing, has been built by social housing or councils. And we can't rely on the developers to do it themselves because they've never actually done it in the past. And that is just recognising the reality of house building. So on the Isle of Wight, I want to halve my targets because I want to preserve my landscape. I want to preserve my tourism economy. But out of those 300 houses, I pretty much want every single one to be built for a social purpose. If a housing developer wants to buy a plot of land in Sandown and Shankton and Ryde, let them and build swanky houses or second homes. But if we are talking about targets, we need to have control of that on the island, because we need to offer young people on the island or in Portsmouth or Southampton a chance of growing up somewhere near where they lived. Because at the moment, all we're doing is importing pensioners. And so you have pockets of wealth, London and Birmingham, Manchester, and pockets where the money gets spent on adult social care, Devon, Dorset, the island, Cornwall. That is a bad thing for our country. So Robert, would you please design me, or I'll help you design it, a system that will work for all our people, will mean that the Isle of Wight pays into the Exchequer rather than just being, gizmo money for adult social care. And actually, let's get mixed communities of mixed demographics where young people and old people live side by side, but young people have a chance of affordable homes in those constituencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Gillian, how similar is Chichester to the Isle of Wight?
Well, it is quite similar. It's got a lot of similarities. So the base question, do we want to continue with a home-owning democracy? Having spent many years in business, the first thing I would do is ask the customer. And I haven't met a young person who doesn't want to own their own home. There are discussions about, whether we're moving into a rental economy where people would rent a car for an hour and all these things which make life more convenient. But I think when it comes to home ownership, there's something more than that, and certainly security, financial security, but also affordability throughout your lifetime, including when you're older, is very important. And the problem, obviously, with the rental market is, by and large, you will understand, unless you're in an unusual economy, that actually your mortgage is cheaper than your rent, and you are at the same time normally building up some kind of nest egg. And that actually could even be, I was before this panel, on the entrepreneur panel, and hearing about how people had actually started their businesses by taking equity out of their home owning. And I certainly know many people in London whose homes have earned a lot more than they have in the last 10 years and probably will continue to do so. But this is a little bit of a southeast issue as well. So where I grew up is a place called Knowsley in Merseyside, and my cousins, young cousins, all of whom still live there, are still buying homes, the same as my parents did, same as I did, in their 20s and early 30s, usually with a partner, occasionally with a sibling, and they're still buying a 3-bedroom semi, which later on they'll stick a loft conversion in and maybe even a conservatory, depending on aspirational they are. But, they're all still doing exactly as we always did. And that's because actually the houses there have not gone up very much. My nan's council house, which she had bought and then sold to pay for her social care, we sold about 2 years ago for less than £60,000. And this is nice on a nice estate. It's somewhere where, you would be happy to live. So I think when you look, and some of the figures you read out, Jack, the first thing I thought of was, actually, we need those figures by different parts of the country, because it isn't the same all across the country. And there are also different customers that we're targeting. So the first is this concept of affordable housing in the southeast. It really is a question of what is affordable and who's it affordable to, because the vast majority, certainly in my constituency and probably in Bob's for sure as well, it isn't affordable, because the average salary versus the starter home price, which is about 350,000, is nowhere, it's 16 times the average salary. And that's an issue. When you look at what is driving the unaffordability of homes, I'd like to go back even further from the developers, because actually it starts before the developers. It starts with land prices. And what's happening, which is astonishing, you would never design a system like this, but we have the local plans that people try to put together what their housing numbers, their housing needs, where their strategic land supplies are, and they have to do this with 5 years hence. And of course then everybody is hoping to be a strategic land supplier, because your land that was previously worth a few thousand per acre is suddenly worth millions. And what happens initially is actually all of the value goes to the landowners. And you see this time and time again. Agricultural land then gets planning permission, it becomes, or even church land. I could hardly bear to listen to the Archbishop of Canterbury lecturing us when the church owns half the land in the country and could actually give a lot of it away to social houses. Of course, we do need more social housing in the southeast. That affordability gap is not going to be closed anytime soon. So if you want key workers, if you want young families to stay, you need to have those houses. But there's a great business case. I've been talking to our local housing association, Hyde, with our council. It's a very easy business case for them to invest in areas like Chichester and the Isle of Wight, and they will do it. And the new council houses, which I've been into loads of them, are really nice. They're very well designed. They're super, really lovely, like almost chalet style. So really very well designed. I think that the thing about, so we need to fix signalling to the market that we're going to basically make land worth probably 100 or 200 times more than it was the week before we signalled what it was going to be. And that seems to me quite an obvious thing that we need to, because once you've got the land price so high, then the developers need to make their money. Then you've got the SIL money or Section 106 money going back into, this is all just adding cost, which eventually is paid for by the person who buys the house. And the other thing about affordable houses is usually if you say you've got to have 20 or 30% affordable houses, actually the other houses on that plot will be subsidising that because the developer will be actually trying to get back a return on their investment. So I think we need to look much more broadly at how we plan our places and how we manage the land that we want to build the houses on. The other thing that a lot of younger people would like to live in cities, and a lot of our high streets, towns and cities are dying. And I think there is definitely a case to have specific focus on a lot of people who are leaving maybe student accommodation to the next generation. They call them pocket apartments or micro apartments or studio apartments, but in city centres, which are good for transport links and are a good stepping stone for people to either have an affordable rented place or even a rent which could then go on to buy, and of course to save more money, property ISAs. We need to do a lot more on property ISAs. I think they're a brilliant idea. There was an idea, I think somebody said this week, about maybe giving everybody a property ISA from when they're born. If you do build up from a very young age, your property ISAs are actually quite valuable by the time you come to buy. And I think whether it's given from the age you're born or there's some other way that incentivizes others doing that, I think it would be worthwhile doing. So, of course, these plug-and-play studio homes would have broadband, so you could play, and they would have all of the sort of low-risk early homes as well. You don't want to be spending your weekends puttying window frames or painting, or doing DIY. That's not probably what most people are thinking of. But there needs to be that kind of housing which is a city centre or very much focused on regenerating our high streets as well. And that means we need to have a planning system that enables the players involved to plan the place based on the needs of having a mixed society and making sure that we can fulfil the dream of home ownership, which I don't think will die in this country during my lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Stephen.
Thank you. So I completely agree that in terms of our sort of culture and history, people want to be part of a property-owning democracy, and the voter pressure for that is not going to go away. From a kind of, if I put my wonkish hat on, I can go, well, there are lots of reasons why that isn't necessarily desirable, but ultimately the voters get what the voters want, and I just think it's, whenever someone talks about, oh, well, we're more like Germany or more like this other country, well, we're not Germany, and ultimately the demands of politicians have to be slightly shaped by the aspirations of the voters who they either want to elect or re-elect them. I do also think there are broader values to ownership. I am one of the astonishingly rare group of millennials who does own my own house, which is, well, my own flat. And my flat is weirdly, of course, in microcosm the history of house building policy in this country. It was originally started life as a council house, which was originally started being built under Harold Wilson, was completed under Ted Heath, was bought under the right to buy by its then tenant, then sold to a buy-to-let landlord who I actually rented from for a while before selling it to my partner and I, thanks to our help to buy ISA. So it's a weird sort of mixture of housing policy interventions. Of course, the value of that era of housing is, as a result, it is a genuinely mixed community. There are blocks of flats which have families in, there are blocks of flats which have people like me who quite like their children around to look at, as long as you can hand them back afterwards. It has elderly people. It does not have that kind of sort of horrible new housing development thing where you effectively have like a house, block of flats for people without children, block of flats for people with children, and then a block of flats for the elderly. And I think I completely agree with all of the panel that you're not going to unlock the housing crisis unless the state gets back into the game of building houses as well. Although everyone aspires to own their own home, not everyone will. And the I think the crucial thing about social letting is part of the benefit of owning your own home is you suddenly have a sense of obligation to the place you're in. Things like the chute breaking, and I feel this very keenly because I own in the block I used to rent in. Things like the chute getting stuffed up, which before you go, oh, someone else will phone the council. Oh, I can't be bothered to deal with working out what's got stuck in there, has suddenly become something I've actually started to become like a telegraph reader about. I get very annoyed. I started going to my leasehold, our tenants association meetings with the leaseholders and the other tenant associations. And of course, the group of people who do not bother to go to those meetings are people in the private rented sector. Why? Because they know that they can be turfed out by their landlord almost at any point. They don't have a stake or a sense of community. And I think unless you have a situation in which there are people who have a sense that they are not going to be moved unless they want to, you do not have that sense of security, that sense of pride in your place and belonging. And you also will have an electorate much more inclined to embark on radical experiments of one kind or another. In terms of the second half of the question, which is how do you encourage millennials to save more? Well, partly building more, right? Why doesn't the average millennial save for a house? Because for the average millennial, that would be a really stupid thing to do with their money. I mean, if I were to tell, the reason why we were able to buy is bluntly, one of my partner's relatives died. If I were to tell one of my friends from school they should be saving for a house, they would quite rightly look at me as if I had gone mad. They might as well save to finance their own mission to Mars at the current rate than we build homes. There are other things we can do, new mortgage products, whether it's 100-year mortgages like they have in Japan, looser lending requirements. But equally, there is another half to this saving equation, right? Which is that if you are the average millennial, you on top of your income tax have an opt-in pension and a 9% marginal rate in the form of your tuition fee loans. One of the slightly surreal experiences if you're a millennial at Conservative Party conference is you can go to event hearing people talk about the iniquities of the 50p rate for people who are earning the top rate. And yet if you are a millennial on the 40p rate, so if you're a millennial who is head of their department at the average school in London, if you are a millennial who is a doctor, you are paying a 50p rate because of your tuition fees. And although I am, a zealot for the idea that there should be some form of graduate component, at the point that I am paying a 9p additional rate, if you're standing up and going, we're the party of low taxes with a straight face, well, that is the case. I mean, like, who are you trying to kid? Clearly, apparently, you're successfully kidding yourself, but you're certainly not kidding any millennial voters. And I think unless you have that mixture of greater incentives to save through greater buildings, an evening of the tax and spend burden on one generation so it has more take-home income, you are not going to get a property-owning democracy as a sustainable force. You will continue to struggle to win over the young, and of course it will mean an electorate which is more inclined to radical experimentation.
Fantastic. Before we go to the audience, I want to quickly ask the panel: do you think a focus on home ownership, on government supporting home ownership, is at the neglect of supporting the private rental sector? Because in the past 8 years, to me, there seems to be an utter focus on supporting people on home ownership, and very little towards the private rental sector.
I think there's probably some truth in that. I think there's three debates here. One is around houses, social houses to rent. One is around private renters, and then one is about purchasing a home. I think at one point, as a Conservative, we felt that only the debate around purchasing your own home mattered, and that should be the focus of all of our attention. Now, as a Conservative, for all the reasons I think the panel just described, I think that probably is the most important one, because that's our long-term ambition that most of us still, perhaps it's a peculiarly British thing, but it's in our DNA, we want to own a home. So that should be our objective. And I remember having conversations with people like, David Cameron, who say, but don't young people just want to buy a home? Surely that's what, at the end of the day, that's what they want. So that's what we should be focusing our attention on. And I think that's true, but we've now come to the point that the crisis is so significant that you've got to go after all three of these. This is a campaign now on three fronts. You've got to build more homes for social rent, where you can have some security of tenure and pride in your community. Perhaps that's a stepping stone to purchasing a home in the private market. you've got to be getting the home ownership challenge for private, individuals purchasing a home. But you can't, because the scale of the challenge is so great and it's going to take us some time to correct it, you can't neglect these issues about renters. And that's why I think we, as a party, perhaps belatedly, have come round to the view that we have to be tackling these issues, like the length of tenure that you can get as a renter, or, as I said earlier, whether, perhaps they may seem trivial things, but whether your broadband is a utility or not, so that when you turn up in your new flat, you have it just as you would water and gas and electricity. I think we have to be as focused on those issues, but it isn't a zero-sum game. It's a war on three fronts.
Yeah, I would agree. And all of them have their challenges. So social housing rental, clearly a lot of the social houses were sold off and not many have been built to replace them. And I think we need to look at where they're built most specifically, because you could segment the market to make sure that you're building the right social housing, and it probably is around cities around the southeast. Private rental, in a way, it's in a way that's only consolidating, I guess, the wealth divide in a way. Most people would like to be able to own their own home, which gets to supply and demand. And from a government viewpoint, it's much easier to try and change supply than to interfere in the private rental market. There has been interference in the private rental market, but again, it's not going to fix the areas that need fixing. So I think social housing, build more in the areas we need, and then try to segment the kind of housing we need and the affordability to who, because it's almost like we need to start in a different place. I can afford 200 grand if I buy it with my other half. After I've saved for a reasonable period of time, what can I buy for that? And what does that look like? And how is that going to meet my needs? Actually, my needs are not the same as my parents necessarily. I'm much more flexible about how and what I live in, but how do I meet that need? And you don't see that many developers. You've got some examples around the other cities in the world where there's some really different kind of development going on. But if you look at the development in this country, it's pretty much the same as it looked 30 years ago, which is, small little boxy houses next to small little boxy houses. And I'm not sure everybody really wants to live like that now.
Stephen,
Well, yeah, the private rented sector has got to become a scenario that is desirable for some people to end up in permanently. Because bluntly, there are people who are, if you are 44, 45, you are not, regardless of what the government does on house building, going to end up in a situation in which you are going to exit the private rented sector in all probability. And also, the flip side of that is one of the problems we have with property prices is that the buy-to-let market is such a lucrative place to be. George Osborne actually did do some very sensible things in his 2015 budget to try and get people to exit the sector, because as well as thinking about the regulation of the condition of tenants in the micro, there is a problem that there are lots of people who frankly should not be in the business of being buy-to-let landlords. Right? There are far too many small businesses, people who in fact are, own one home, do not manage it very well because it's not their profession. So it's also partly about thinking about creating a desirable rented market. A situation in which you have people who have expertise in being landlords, right? When I was a renter, the only service I had that was being provided for me by an amateur was my housing. And that's part of what needs to change as well. Because, again, it all comes down to that sense of security and belonging in your place. And if you don't have that, then, you end up in your current predicament, not to intrude on private grief.
I was going to let Bob have a final word, then we'll go for a Q&A. We've got half an hour for questions.
John, I should be very brief. Yes, it's a simple answer. We have to get the little things right, which is whether you've got broadband or not in your house when you get there. We have to get the medium stuff right. So, for example, why did we remove the rebate for those people who are refurbishing properties above shops? Over to you, Robert. And we have to get the big stuff right, which is building the right buildings, also giving the councils the freedom to build, working to make sure that we get the right type of housing and an increased supply of housing, which is, we need to get all three of those right, and we haven't so far, because I think we're being a little too timid.
Okay. Who has a question? I should say, Robert, you need to leave at 10 to? Oh, no, sorry, not 10, no, it's 20 past. Right?
Yeah,
yes, correct. Okay, great. So, okay. Gentleman at the front, just wait for the microphone. When we'll go for another one. And then, yeah.
Oh, is that working?
Yes.
Oh. John Robinson from Southwell in the Newark constituency. You've been speaking ages about renting. We're here to talk about buying. But however, we do need more social housing, and there are lots of schemes, aren't there? There are shared ownership, whereby the council buys land and it builds houses or supports people building houses. Shared rent, shared ownership. And you've got all sorts of, you've got incentives for builders. Small builders need developing, because at the moment the developers, the big firms, are building nearly all of the houses in vast numbers, and they want to build 4-bedroom houses. Bob's description of the Isle of Wight is exactly identical in Southwell. There's far too many big houses being built. So, I've said enough on that, I think. Perhaps you can develop the various models. But the other thing on the practicality, as I was growing up, I was 12 when the war ended, as I was growing up, thousands and thousands of prefabs were built. They're lightweight, very small, simple foundations, and they were going up all over the place. What about developing, encouraging businesses to prefabricate houses? You can get vast numbers built. It would be a step on the ladder, a small step maybe, but it would be a step on the ladder.
Okay, and then the gentleman.
Thank you very much. I know you're looking for question marks, but I've got two very brief statements to make. One is, I live in Devon, so Bob is my hero, and I'd like to have a chat with Gillian about residual valuation. I'm a chartered surveyor too, because the land value is actually fixed by the amount that you can sell the house for, and it's not the other way around. But my question is, in our generation, we actually benefited from Myra's tax relief, which meant that we were actually buying with a competitive advantage against the buy-to-let market. Is now the time to reintroduce that mortgage tax relief?
Okay. Quickly go to Bob, because you want to respond first.
What a wonderful question. John, it's so lovely to see you. John is a member of the regiment up in Nottinghamshire that my grandfather died leading in World War II, so it is lovely to see you as ever. And I'm very happy, actually, that Newark has more old folks than the Isle of Wight. So, right. Lots of good ideas, but the long and short of it is. Sorry, what was your idea? What was your question again, John? Sorry.
Oh, no,
sorry, I do apologise. Sure, okay, there are lots and lots of. Okay, good. Thank you. There are lots of good schemes. The problem is we're being too timid about pushing them. My council on the Isle of Wight has 35 sites. Is Chris Quirk still here? Chris, hello. Head of the planning department of the Isle of Wight councillors. We are desperate to be able to build out those 35 sites over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years ourselves. I want to cut out developers from the island because I want the council doing it. The council and I are in unison, but we are struggling to get the government to listen to us because we can't get access to government cash. So we have to let the developers build the houses that we don't want in order to get a little bit of money for the houses that we need. That is not a functioning system, Robert. It's a dysfunctional system, and I'm not the only person to feel that. I want to solve the problems that you have because I want Southampton and Portsmouth to go blue. I want to deliver you a prosperous Isle of Wight that pays into the Exchequer and more Conservative seats at the next election. But you need local flexibility and local understanding and lots of good ideas in between to make that happen, because we are bursting to do the right thing in the island if only you'll let us. Thank you.
Who'd like to take prefabs? Who'd like to take?
Actually, I would. So my grandmother's life was changed by her prefab. Not that much, but she, both my grandparents were homeless when they came back from the war, and my mum was in an orphanage because basically they went to female only and male only hostels, and there was nowhere for families, and their life was changed by a prefab. And throughout her life, my nan loved her prefab because it gave her chance to build a proper family life, and I think that's what we continue to need to do. If you look at, I've seen some of the latest prefab houses, and I've been in a number of them, and they are fantastic. I think there is definitely, and I've been trying to work this through with my own council, is is there a position where we could almost provide serviced plots that people could buy their chalet-style prefab houses, which you can buy them, and they're much more affordable than other houses that you would get built, and whether you kind of see them in the park homes, but it's like a very good quality park home with a brilliant landlord, that's the council. Is that an option going forward? So they're all the things that I think up and down the country councils are considering and are talking about, getting more social housing, getting the right type of social housing, looking again at prefabs, the quality of prefabricated. I think Philip Hammer was talking about 3D printing things to in your home today. The quality of prefab houses, they kind of have a bit of a stigma, but the new ones are amazing. So I definitely think, however, I'm still not sure that your average millennial will want to live. It depends where they are, of course, because usually they tended to be not in city centres. So I still think we need to have a very much of a mixed approach for different markets, for different segments of the market. But I'm very much of a fan as well of looking at those prefabricated options, and they're quick, most importantly.
Robert, do you want to talk about the mortgage tax relief?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, we have done this to a limited extent because we created the Help to Buy ISA, and that's a vehicle for people to save. And if you're a basic rate taxpayer, it's not dissimilar to having 100% tax relief, because you'll get your savings topped up by 25%. But it's to a limited extent, and I think there's definitely, if you take this issue seriously, as I do, then there's an argument for increasing schemes like that and making them more generous. We have quite significantly tipped the balance away from buy-to-let back towards private individuals purchasing, and that's, it's not been an easy transition, and there are many people across the country who bought properties. I appreciate Stephen's view that some of them were not expert landlords, but a lot of them were ordinary people who use those properties as their savings, their pension, and so on. And it's not been, and it won't be in the next year or two, an easy transition for them. But those changes do seem to be having an effect, and that the buy-to-let sector is significantly less desirable than it was. And you are seeing the scales being tipped somewhat back in favour of private purchases for their own homes. So although that hasn't been an easy transition to make, it is one that we will continue to put our shoulder to the wheel on. In terms of John's question on prefabs, well, I'm not sure prefabs is the sort of branding you want to give them, but we are actually backing very strongly what we call modern methods of construction. So modular building, both in the public sector and in the private sector. In fact, not so far away from here in Coventry, we're funding a sort of centre of excellence to look at that and trying to push it forward. And we've made a presumption now in government in the last year that anything that's built in the public sector that draws on the taxpayer for funding should, in the first instance, explore whether they can do it in a modular way. And we're not just doing that to save money. It may, in fact, even cost more money initially, but we're doing it to try and stimulate a market that will hopefully feed through into housing once it's been in the public sector.
Stephen, purchase a prefab. Is that the line that's going to win the Conservatives the next election?
Well, I think people are willing to compromise on house quality. I mean, I have friends who live in those new pocket homes who weirdly also think it's weird that I want to live in an ex-local authority home, right? I go in there, things I go, but my flat's so much bigger than yours, so I don't understand why is it really worth paying this much more to live in a glass and steel building? But so people will make compromises that they want to make in order to live in a type of house they're happy in. I think the problem, though, with the sort of prefab model, I actually think that I'm just going to check no one from the NS is in here so I don't lose my remaining bits of lefty credibility. But actually, I think one of the things that the government has done a really good job is gently easing people out of the buy-to-let market without triggering a crash, which would be much, much worse for renters and also for buy-to-let landlords. But there's a really important Act of Parliament I think needs to change, which is I won't say the 1961, but towards the end of the Macmillan government, which means that the cost of the land is set by the most you could theoretically make by building on it, which means that none of these new products are incentivized if you have a situation where you are a developer buying the land at the price you would make from it if you were going to build an oligarch's mansion. And I think unless you fix both of those things, you don't have the market incentive for someone to build a pocket home or a prefab or a modular housing unit. And unless you change both those things, I don't think the product arises. But that's something which is free, you could do without troubling anyone in the Treasury. So there are low-hanging fruit and easy wins here.
Okay, we'll go to the middle of the room for questions. Yes, you send striped shirt, and then guy just behind.
Okay, so thank you. My name is Ian Bastable. I'm a councillor from Fareham. The answer to the question was given you, Robert, by Gillian in the presentation, and in fact the answer to the question is in the question. The problem here is that we don't have a home-owning democracy, we have a property-owning democracy. And the reason for this is because it's the one asset class that you can invest in and not pay capital gains tax on. And so what we end up with, you said it in your presentation, people earning more money through their property and not being taxed on it than they do through the work and hard work and all things that we Conservatives want them to do. So I would suggest that you maybe do abolish the whole of stamp duty, but you introduce, very slowly and carefully, not to cause a crash, capital gains on primary residence. And this will slowly, over time, change home ownership from an investment and the biggest investment we get and being my pension and all that kind of thing into having a home. And then the price won't be out of range, and then people will be able to afford these and get the mortgages with the multipliers. And so then the suppliers, there'll be more demand that can actually be met by the builders, and then I'll have more control as deputy chair of my planning committee and build the kind of houses and the places we want with social housing and everything else. I think the real cause of this problem, the reason we've seen this over the last 20 years, is because it's been better for people to invest in something they don't pay tax on than other things, and their house is actually an investment rather than a home. So I think the answer is in the question. Do you have my question to you, so you must answer it with a question. Has the Treasury ever looked at the abolishing of stamp duty and putting capital gains on primary residence? Because this has changed the tax system. It will have a huge difference to this problem.
Good question.
In my opinion, sorry.
Guy behind you.
Hi, Leon Hargreaves. I bought a flat earlier this year, one-bedroom flat, and being able to use Help to Buy and not paying stamp duty was massively helpful for me personally. My mortgage is around £420 a month, but renting the same property would be £700 to £800, and I don't get anything from renting that. So I'm not really a massive believer in interfering with that, but how can we kind of change that, and maybe renters can get something back for the double that they're paying instead of the mortgage?
Okay, I'm going to go straight to Robert on capital gains tax on primary residence.
Well, as far as I'm aware, we haven't looked into that. I mean, I think it's although it does have its distortions, I think it's a good thing that you can purchase your own home and have the confidence to know that when you sell it, you're not going to be subject to capital gains tax. I think that's everything we've just said on this panel, is that owning your own home, having the security that comes with that is part of the DNA of being British. So I think creating a new tax that suddenly penalises people when they want to sell their home, perhaps upgrade, or downsize when they're older, it doesn't strike me as a good idea. There is a big issue more broadly in this country that we overemphasise investment in property beyond our own home, and so if you look at people investing in second homes, third homes, buy to let and so on, as opposed to investing in venture capital, angel investing, that's one of the big issues affecting our productivity as a country, and there could be ways that you could use the tax system to tip the balance and encourage that type of person who has some spare cash, not just to plough it back into homes to rent out, but actually into things that create innovation and jobs and move the economy forward.
I'd like to come in on that, because I think I've invested in a venture capital fund which is invested in 19 startup tech businesses. It may or may not be a good investment yet because it's quite young, but I think demystifying those kind of investments would probably be a good thing to do. And actually, I think in terms of capital gains tax, it's already having, even on second homes, it's distorting the market to some degree. There's an awful lot of people that would like to sell their places that they'd invested in. Perhaps their first flat they bought in London, they kept it as an investment, they moved out with the family a bit further on, and they would sell that flat now. But capital gains tax is part of what puts them off. So I think we've got to also be think about that. But I think it's all, we do have a huge problem with housing. So we do need to be a bit more radical, I think. And I think, it is worth considering as a range of measures, but you would have to, it would be politically very difficult to sell. So you would have to, it would have to get rid of a whole load of other barriers in the market before you could consider doing that. But I still believe that, fundamentally it's about, fixing the land value. I mean, I wasn't aware of why it was as it is, but, the highest value, as you alluded to. But a lot of the value is going actually in the initial purchase of the land, and then you've got, as you say, it's much better to build easier and more rewarding to build a mansion than a whole load of other types of housing, which are the types we want. That needs to be fixed, so we have to have the right incentives so that we get the properties we want, not the ones that will pay back the massive investment in the land and pay back the massive profits that people are trying to make from this. So that's definitely got to be fixed, so we get what we need, what the market needs, which is not what's being built in many cases.
Yeah. Wouldn't landowners say fixing the land value would infringe on their property rights?
Well, they probably would, but if you think about it, agricultural land, I hear this all the time in my area. So agricultural land has a value, but as soon as agricultural land has a chance of being changed planning permission, the value becomes massively more per acre. So there seems to be a way that, it's only because they've been given a different permission by the council that's changed that value. So surely it'd be better for whoever, maybe the council, to buy it beforehand, or to have a different rule in terms of that exploitation of, because yes, but it wasn't worth that the day before. So it's not really like it's not a market. It's not a proper market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On the difference in cost between renting and owning your home, one way we could do that is we could regulate rent. We could regulate the price of homes as well. Would that be attractive in Isle of Wight, Bob?
No, I don't think it would. And I think all this question about fixing land prices, I think, is just going to be very complex. It's fundamentally anti-capitalist. It's pretty anti-democratic. And I think there are simply better ways of dealing with this problem, one of which is basically giving the councils money to allow them to build. So
where do they get the land from?
We've already had this discussion, so I don't want to repeat myself because we want to get some more questions in. But no, fixing land prices won't work. We need to give councils the freedom to build.
On what land?
Robert, I know you need to dash off in a second.
On what land, Gillian? We've got 35 plots of land, but we can't afford, because we can't access the cash, because we don't have a housing revenue account, we can't build.
Okay,
if we could
well, that's
access that
another
land,
specific.
we could be built. If we could access the money, we'd be building houses.
If you own the land, then it's fair enough, yeah.
Yeah, Robert, any word on fixing land values?
Well, I tend to go further than some people do on planning reforms and edge towards the position that Gillian's really set out, that I think we have to sorry, John. John's actually in my association, so I'm used to him heckling me. I think we've got to accept that there is an imbalance here. There isn't a perfect market when you've got somebody owning a piece of land they purchased for £10,000 or £15,000, and then we build the Oxford to Cambridge Expressway costing you, the taxpayers, £5 billion next door to it, and it becomes worth £5 million. And I think we do have to think of ways in which we can extract some of that land value back so we can deliver the infrastructure, because in my experience, people in all parts of the country are crying out for more infrastructure. We've underinvested in it for a generation. We need to spend significantly more on our road, railways and public services like schools and so on when we build new homes. That's one of the main reasons why communities can be hostile to new housing, because they don't think the infrastructure is going to be there. And the public purse can't afford to pick up all of that bill. So I do think we'll have to do that. And in terms of planning reform, I feel that in Parliament today, this is an issue which I think is increasingly generational. And in my experience, not necessarily younger, but newer MPs tend to feel the urgency of this issue more than some others. And I think further planning reforms will come. and I think they need to come pretty quickly.
But Robert, it's not just about more houses, more houses, more houses. Communities are hostile to housing because no community that I've ever come across complains about an extra 5 or 10 or 15 homes in a village. What they resent is some developer slopping down 700 homes, which ruins their quality of life, because Nimbys are basically people who value things that government can't or won't, like beauty, like a sense of place, like a view, like peace and quiet. And the problem is, as long as you simply force through supply side, you are not going to get the support of conservatives up and down the country for these proposals. That's why we need a better way forward that works with the grain of local authorities and local communities more. And if we did that, we would solve this problem more quickly than we are doing. That's the issue.
Can we give Rob a brief round of applause before he has to go? Stephen, we've heard about fixing land values. We've heard about how developers should not be controlling the housing market. We've heard about how solving the housing crisis, we need to give more money from the state towards house building. Can we therefore conclude that on the biggest domestic issue of our time, all the ideas for solving it come from the left?
I mean, I think the big dividing line is actually open v closed. Sorry, that was a very dull Blairite joke. But no, I don't think that is fair, partly because, right, ultimately, particularly in housing, this idea, and you're exactly right, this idea that something exists that could be described as a market is just nonsense, right? It's not a market now, partly because something like housing, just for obvious reasons, isn't susceptible to market pressure in lots of ways. So actually, the odd thing is not so much it's a question of left v right, but I think you kind of, the thing that you are beginning as a party to free yourselves from, and I think Robert's exactly right to say it is about MPs who've been in the Commons for a while versus MPs who've perhaps come in more recently, then it's not actually a question of left v right. It is about how do you regulate something which just is not a market, right? It does not function like a market. And seeing it as one leads you into these kind of weird rabbit warrens where you come up with sort of weird conclusions. Because, yeah, it just isn't one.
It doesn't demand ideology, it demands practicality.
That's another Blairite line.
Okay, I wasn't a politician until about a year ago, so maybe I'm reinventing the wheel.
I promise we go to the right of the room. So the woman over there in the glasses, and then the gentleman towards there.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on the shared ownership. I come from Lancashire, and a small area where I live, there are a couple of developments at the moment. There's one that's actually just been built. It's going to be 200 properties in total. And so initially the developer is putting 11 houses at the front of the development, and they're properties that are going to be priced between 300 and 450,000. So that tells you that they're 4 or 5 bedroom detached houses. So I went along to the site to ask about shared ownership. And I'm told that there's going to be 8 properties. They're going to be in a terrace. And they're not going to be ready for 2 years. And they're going to be at the rear of the development. Now, I went to see a development that's been finished in...
I must ask for a question. We've got 5 minutes.
So the question is, I wonder if you could urge developers to think about more affordable housing. Out of 200 houses, I think 8 small shared ownership houses at the back of a development is particularly wrong, because all the others have huge gardens and drives, and these 8 haven't got drives. Their dustbins have to sit at the front of the house because they can't get them to the rear. It's just not right. They're second-class citizens, I'm sorry.
And then the gentleman, yes, in the blue shirt. Thank you. And the red tie.
Thank you. Rob Hunter from Midland Housing Association. My question's also about shared ownership, but from a slightly different angle. I think shared ownership is hugely more accessible than some of the other schemes we've talked about. We've put forward shared ownership schemes where people need less than half of the deposit that they would otherwise need. And on house prices, certainly vastly less than 300, 400. So if we are serious about accessible way. Am I holding it wrong or something? Of people getting onto the housing ladder, then I think shared ownership has huge potential, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we can encourage more. Thank you.
Okay, so 2 questions on can we rely on private developers to provide more affordable homes, and what's the potential of shared ownership? We'll go from left to right.
106 money doesn't work. The current system doesn't work to provide affordable homes. That's why councils, the government has to have a more generous system for enabling councils, be it the Isle of Wight or be it anywhere else, to develop home-owning companies. And, you know, beauty and traditional materials and the look of the place should be as important. Because one of the most depressing things about the amount of modern housing being built, actually so much of it is so second-rate and looks awful. And we're just building slums of the future as far as I can see. So if we actually have proper, you know, council spending, but actually, you know, in good quality housing that is going to stand the test of time, that is the answer. As regards to shared ownership, frankly, anything that works we should back. There's a scheme called Rent Plus that does really good work. I mean, on the island, we're going to be experimenting with all sorts of shared ownership schemes. This is another reason why the centre has to relax, as the Cameronites would say, chillax a bit, and it just has to hand down power to local authorities to experiment. So when you have really good local authorities, like the Conservatives running the Isle of Wight, we can work in tandem to find the best way of providing really good quality shared ownership schemes that other people can then use as a model, or we can learn from other people.
Gillian.
I mean, I think shared ownership is a good model, but you're right. I'm actually surprised because when I go around some of the developments in Chichester, you can't tell actually aesthetically which ones are shared ownership, which ones are social housing to rent, and which ones are to buy. I don't know whether we just got particularly lucky with some of the developments, but they, you know, they are very good, and you can't tell you know, the difference between them. But up and down the country, councils are constantly negotiating with developers the percentage of affordable homes. So you put a percentage in your local plan, it will probably be 40%. Then it will be negotiated down at each time, where they'll say we can't actually afford to, because they're cross-subsidised. Let's be honest, what is an affordable home? It is cross-subsidised by the rest. So, you know, it's in the developer's interest to get as few as possible, because they can sell them at 80% of the market value, 80% of what they could have sold them at otherwise. And that's the model, and that's why it's always a negotiation and a tension. Depending on the council, depending on the housing association, depending on the relationships, depending on the leverage, those outcomes of the negotiation can be different. Sometimes you'll still get 30-40% social affordable housing. Sometimes it'll be down to 15-20%. And usually you find in those that are better plots, let's say right in the middle of city or close to amenities, particularly train stations, there's a pressure for them to be even lower. So it's a negotiation that's happening. It's actually a negotiation that's delaying a lot of development as well. So you know, we've said a lot. You know, this isn't actually a normal market, and it starts from the land to the development and the building, and we do need to look at those things that could work better, because it's certainly true we are not getting either the right housing, the right type of housing, and certainly having houses shoved at the back with nowhere to put your bin just because it's the affordable housing is completely wrong.
Stephen.
Well, I think it comes back to, and I'm not going to pretend I think all developers would behave in a fair way if you didn't have the perverse incentives we have now, but it comes back to the fact that the developer can only buy that land at the price that it's worth if they are going to have lots and lots of very expensive homes. And unless you fix that, and of course we shouldn't forget that, yeah, I do not think repealing a law in 1961 can possibly be seen as interfering in the free market, unless your contention is that there was no free market economy in the United Kingdom from, you know, the year dot to 1961, right? I mean, not Macmillan's government not usually held up as an example of a liberalising, buccaneering free market conservatism, but yeah, and until that changes, why you know, you'd be mad not to do what that developer is doing, because otherwise you are operating at a loss. And yeah, unless you address land banking, I don't think you're going to address the incentives that exist within our current housing market.
Thank you, Stephen. So I promised our events manager that we would finish at 1:30 the dot, so we will finish at 1:30 the dot. So the original question was, should we try to maintain the home-owning democracy? I think in conclusion we can probably say yes, but it's going to be bloody difficult. So can we say thank you to the speakers and thank you to yourselves.
Thank you.